Recording in progress.
Okay, good morning and hello everyone. Welcome to the decolonization panel. It's a hot topic this year and we're so happy that we could get some really, esteemed and experienced panelists to talk to us about this. Moderating the session will be Madhuri Ramesh from Azim Premji University. Madhuri, take it away.
Hi, good morning. I'm excited to be moderating this panel today. And I want to introduce the speakers to you all first. Although unfortunately, two of them have not been able to join us today, and we have another person who has kindly agreed to step in. But first, I'd like to introduce Michael Hoffman, who is with the Primate Research Center Institute at Kyoto University, and he has studied macaques for 40 years. He's also interested in ethnobotany, indigenous knowledge, interdisciplinary collaborations. And Michael has also seen a lot of conservation play out in front of his eyes and will tell us more about what got him interested in this topic of decolonizing conservation. The second panelist we have today is Minket Leptra, who is a filmmaker. She has traced the journey of the river Teesta from source to the delta, and she's very interested in how Himalayan communities relate to the environment and how storytelling is such an integral part of this ecological relationship. She has won several awards for her film on Teesta, and she has also curated an online exhibition on the water heritage of Northeast India. And our third panelist today is Samira Agnihotri, who did her master's in the National Center for Biological Sciences and a PhD thereafter on drongos, among other creatures. And like Michael, Samira has branched out enormously from her official topic. And she has also spent a lot of time with the Soliga people in the Biligiri Rangan Hills. And that has been one of the reasons for her interest in decolonizing conservation. She is also interested in indigenous languages, and she has worked on some collaborations on documenting them. We were supposed to have John Aini and Gladson Dundun join us today, but unfortunately, due to network troubles, they haven't been able to sign in. But if we do manage to get them on board a little later in the session, we'll be very happy to hear them speak. So first, let me begin by explaining perhaps very quickly what this idea of decolonizing conservation means. I think as most of us would have heard, the idea of modern conservation is a fairly Eurocentric concept. And therefore, over the past 100 years almost, there have been many times and many instances when people have felt that conservation as we think of it today does not address the needs of local communities. It does not answer their questions or focus on their agendas. I'm in fact pulling out these points from a very evocative talk I heard John Aini give 2 years ago. And so there have been many researchers who may or may not be from indigenous communities themselves who have challenged this sort of singular perspective on what conservation should be and how it should be practiced. They have also repeatedly pushed for the fact that there are multiple ways of understanding the world, that there are different knowledge systems, and they all bring some value and deepen our understanding of nature in different ways. And these voices have also constantly reminded us that it's important to listen to multiple perspectives and give local communities a genuine space to decide how they want to live in nature, with nature, because a lot of conservation is done from the outside and tends to impose certain singular views on what is desirable and what should be done on these communities who actually live in these sites. With that, I would like to invite my panelists, perhaps Michael first, to talk about what decolonizing conservation means to him and how he first began to engage with this topic. Michael?
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be able to participate in this very important gathering, this very important topic. I kind of stumbled onto the whole aspect of conservation from a research-oriented position and a deep empathy for the people who I was welcomed by, the people that I was working with in various parts of the world. When I started my career back at the age of 20, many years ago, I first came here to Japan, and the first thing that I tried to do was to integrate myself into society, to learn the language, to learn the customs, and not to bring my own country and project it on to the people. I came specifically to learn about how people were thinking so that I could expand my own ways of thinking and learn to see things from their perspective, through their language, through their food, through their customs. And it's kind of been a pattern that I've continued with throughout my career in all the different countries that I've worked in. But I've always run up against a similar problem, and that was that most of my senior colleagues were very isolated from the people that they were working with in one way or another. They were focused on going in, collecting their data, and going back and advancing their own careers without really thinking about the people that they were living with. They would just hire people on that would help them do their work, but there wasn't a lot of effort to try and stimulate a discussion, get their thoughts about how things were, how they perceived the nature that we were studying. So I at first unintentionally, through the work that I was doing, I started working with people who were very knowledgeable in a certain aspect of what I was trying to understand. And instead of just taking data, I was asking them to teach me about what they knew about the different things that we were looking at, asking how they perceived what was going on, trying to share ideas. And in a couple different ways, it ended up in very important research projects that I was doing. And now looking back, I could see no other way that I would ever do it differently. We come in to a habitat, to a culture, animal culture, as well as a human culture. And there's so much that we tend to filter out. But if we look at everything as being interconnected, the animals, the people, the air, the water, the plants, then begin to see a different view. And coming from the outside, we really don't understand their perspective, that environment, because we're seeing it through our glasses, focused on a different culture, a different environment where we came from, where everything is very, very familiar to us. But what I've found by interacting and trying to understand people's perspective, as well as animals that we're studying, their perspective, I've seen that we can actually see things much more clearly. We don't need those glasses that we brought with us from our own environments. If we take them off and see what's around us and hear what's around us, then we really have a lot more to gain as science. And I think for people doing conservation will never work unless the local people have an investment in it, unless when a scientist leaves, unless they're going to stay and continue what's important for them, for their livelihood, as well as hopefully protecting if there's something that they didn't already protect or see as something being necessary for their lives, that they'll continue. And I think we all walk away from it with a much bigger understanding, of a much bigger heart, I think, as well, because we grow and we learn from those things. So that's why I think it's so important to decolonize. That's one way of looking at it, but it's really just about empowering the people we work with, creating an environment of equality, inclusiveness, so that everyone can speak freely and we can share ideas. And through that intellectual diversity, then I think our science, our activities, our goals become much more powerful. It's that synergy of ideas, different perspectives, that really make things happen in a much more productive way, I think.
Thanks, Michael. There are a couple of points which I'm definitely going to come back to you about. One is the interesting inversion of who teaches whom, and the other is the idea of communities as equals and not just as people we extract data from.
Right.
Thanks. And Miyoung Kim, could you tell us what got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, first of all. And it's been a very organic journey for me. I think a lot of us, especially coming from indigenous community, do not get time to self-reflect on who we are, what are we about, how are we transitioning from the urban to the rural to the urban, and the migration that we go through. Because in the quest of survival, I think a lot of us do not really get even a space to self-reflect, because most of us are still marginalized in different aspects. And I think it was a very normal childhood, getting educated in a convent and kind of moving on to move on to good jobs and going in a city like Delhi. But I think sometimes movements born by the indigenous communities kind of really pull you if you really kind of self-reflect on who you are. So it was the dam in North Sikkim, which is still going on. And so a lot of dams which is being built in River Tista, and in North Sikkim, Zongo is still voicing their opinion and fight against the dam. So it was this particular movement back in 2007, which kind of really got a space for me to really understand who I was as a lecturer from a community of Eastern Himalaya. So I think that was the time when there was a front page, news article which said that the last shaman of the lecture community is no more. And one of my colleagues kind of mentioned, "Oh, what are you going to do?" So I didn't have any answers to that, and I got an opportunity to interact with so many people from back home who had come to Delhi, Jantar Mantar, and fighting for the dams. So that really gave me a space to understand who I was. And it was not like 1 week or 2 weeks. It was another 5 years for me to really unlearn about who I was and really discover my community. And I went through a lot of to and fro, going to the villages where these dams were being built and interacting with the community, because I think I was still an outsider from my community, even though I am a lecturer. So I think it was a gradual process for me to move from my corporate world to go back to my community. In 2012, I went back and started documenting stories, folklore. And it was during that time when I realized the whole lexicon, the whole narratives, how our elders speak about nature and environment is so different than how we kind of get to study. And I think at an education level, it's a very it's something very technical, but the way they were speaking was like, oh, the River Tista, and Yeti is brothers and sisters, and Ginger is a brother. So I think these kind of relationship that they built in the mountains and the trees and the forest was something very personal. I think that is where I realized that how close we are to the nature, and it was so natural for us. We really didn't have to make an effort because it was there in our system. And I think it was, but like coming back and trying to survive and leaving all your job and trying to do whatever you want to do and following your passion was something very difficult. And actually I started promoting local farmers and small artisans in Darjeeling, but because of the ongoing movement that politically it's very, very volatile. So because of that, it was very difficult to survive. And so we used to have strikes for months and months. So I think that really made me also kind of move on to another job, because I had to transition from one job to another to actually do what I wanted to do. So finally I got a job as a teacher, and that was the time when I got a platform to use these stories that I had documented to the children. And I felt like that was the direct and impactful audience for me, because a lot of us, especially youngsters or even the elders, have to do a lot of unlearning. But for children, if we kind of kind of tell them these stories, it's somewhere we are opening the faculty of wonder. Because I think from a very young age, we are taught to kill our wonder. We are taught to study and not look out of the window. We are taught to kind of don't roam around, but sit in a room and study. So I think the wonder is environment, such an integral part of the wonder, the clouds, the sky. And I think these are very important wisdom which I found in my folklore, especially in the lecture community. We have a lot of environmental history of this region, especially Sikkim, Darjeeling, and certain parts of Kurseong, Siliguri also. So rivers, mountains become an integral part to talk about how the geography of this place was. And so that's how I started collecting stories, and then went travel to Nepal and Bangladesh to talk about their rivers too, because I think it's very important to talk about rivers, because that's something which is often not talked about. We have very much an association with lands and the politics that goes around it. A river is such a fluid topic to talk about, but still an integral part. And then I started realizing that if I can only get a time to reflect on who I am as an indigenous community and kind of empower myself by environment which allows me to grow, then only I think conservation can be at a true level. So here I am as a filmmaker. I got to document the region also right from the mountain community, from like the source till the mountain communities ended, and got to document a lot of other communities. And while we talk about the conservation, we also need to realize that we are still not addressed at a larger scale. We are still not empowered to talk about our own communities. So because of that, these areas, this empowerment comes from an education system, and the language, the stories, the books, the curriculum has to really address and respect the indigenous communities, because I think it just begins with respect to start with, and then I think the conservation eventually organically grows. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for that really eloquent description of how you became interested in this topic. Minkit, like for Michael, there are some points that really stood out for me from what you said, and one of it was your emphasis on the value of reflection. Because we usually find, especially now, that people tend to feel criticizing others is a sign of wokeness, but very rarely is that analytical ability turned towards ourselves and what we do. So I find it very interesting that you are bringing back something of value that we don't hear much about today. And also, I would definitely like to hear more from you a bit later about this idea of wonder and how it's a basis for so many of the relationships we form with other people and with nature around us. So thank you very much for that lovely warm up. Samira, I've known Samira for many years, and she usually has very interesting stories to tell. So Samira, will you share with us today your story of how you became interested in decolonizing conservation?
Sure, thanks, Madhuri, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with Minkit and Michael. It's not very different from what they already shared. I worked with the Soliga community. I have been working with the Soliga community in the BR Hills in South India for the past 15 years now. And about 3-4 years ago, it hit me. It's been a slow realization, like Minkit said, but around 3-4 years ago, it really hit me that none of the work that I have done, none of the research on rongos or birds that I have done for my master's and my PhD, and all the other PhDs and all the other research that's happened in the landscape would have been possible at all without the assistance and the enabling that the community that lives there have provided over all these years. And it just hit me one day that it's completely non-trivial. And we take it for granted in many, many ways, and how we have misused what they have given us in some sense, right? We often just think of people whom we collaborate with locally as, I'm going to be really frank here, as coolies for picking up our luggage, our bags, our field equipment, whereas they are the ones guiding us. They are our guides. And like we have PhD advisors in academia, I would consider these folks my, local science advisors or my research advisors in more ways than one. And it was a very humbling realization for me. And it so happened that I spoke to some colleagues and friends and young folks and realized that a lot of people were thinking along the same lines and feeling the same ethical dilemmas that I had been facing, but they didn't have a space to talk about them or to even discuss them. And as you said, it's become woke to do it to others, but it's very hard, and it can be stunning in a sense when this realization comes to you, that how do you move forward? But unfortunately, I think I've overcome that block that happens when, as somebody said, that you need to move beyond that and just discuss ways to move away from the power that you have and give it to somebody else, and to remove, try to be aware of the privilege that we have. Look at us here, we have internet connectivity and we are really privileged, and that's why we're all talking here. But the people who are actually doing the conservation on the ground, I mean, I'm glad Minkit could join us and Michael could, but the people who have enabled all of this for centuries can't be here because they don't have the internet connectivity, and perhaps they don't speak English, so we ignore them. Yeah, I think I'll stop for now. Otherwise, you know me, I can go on.
That was a lovely term, local science advisor. And I think what you said about fieldwork being a very humbling and an experience that really opens your mind and challenges us also on an ethical dimension in many ways is something that a lot of young researchers will relate to, right? Because when you go to the field, a lot of it seems alien, and by the time you leave, you think of it as my community, my area, and you really have found strong bonds there. Yeah, that's a very interesting transition I think many people go through. Okay, Michael, now I'm going to bounce this back at you. You said, that this openness to learning from people and to thinking of social customs is very important, although you mentioned earlier that you officially went to study macaques, and you said your researcher, in fact, your advisor, in fact, told you that you must become a monkey. So how did that? Why did it matter that A, you should be able to think like a monkey, and B, what did that have to do with understanding the Japanese perspective on macaques, or what they do?
Very good question. Thank you. Yeah, the idea if you want to understand monkeys, you first throw away the textbooks, clear your mind of what other people have said, and become the individual that you want to know, that you want to understand. And that is the monkey in that case. There's been other species besides Japanese monkeys, and even learning about people, it's always the same thing. To become part of that, a community, whether it's a community of animals or a community of people. And animals have their own language. you need to be able to understand what they're doing. To be able to understand what they're doing to interpret what you're seeing. Because if you see it through the eyes of someone else, then you're only seeing what they saw, and you're adding filters between you and the animal, the other being that you're studying, that you're trying to become. So it's led to a lot of different interesting experiences, but it's all about putting yourself in the other's position, whether it's an animal or a person. And when we stop repeating what others have said before and start listening to what is going on in front of you, seeing what's going on in front of you, then textbooks and even your professors who tell you to go and become a monkey, they become secondary to the animals you're watching. And I've given talks in international audiences where I introduce my mentors, and half of them, or maybe more than half of them, aren't human beings, because the specific individuals, because we learn in a population, each individual by name, we have names for them, so we know their genealogies, whose mother, whose father, whose auntie, whose brother, uncle. All of these relationships are just as important in animals as they are in people. So we learn about those things and then interpret in a completely different way than if we were just saying that's animal one, that's what animal two, animal three. It becomes a much more interactive, they're just more understanding about what's going on. It's the same when you're interacting with people. You don't look at a group of people as exotic people. They're people. They're just like you and I. We may speak different languages, so you learn that language to understand what's going on. But that process of becoming part of the surroundings, part of the animals that you're studying, just to be able to understand and to perceive who they are, is really changes the way we perceive, the way we interpret science, the way we interpret things that we see around us. So the mechanism of science changes to some extent. And a lot of people look down on that. They say it's anthropomorphism. But if you look at it from a biological perspective, most of the primates that I'm looking at, we share 95+% of the same genetic material, the same biological things happening. So why shouldn't we be able to interpret a little bit more about what we're seeing? And I think that's part of the process of becoming equals, to put yourself in the other being's perspective, and it becomes less easy to make them into objects or just things that facilitate what you want to have happen. It becomes more of an interaction, and you patiently waiting for things to happen. Or if you're dealing with people of different customs or different backgrounds, you learn how to say yes, and you know when they say yes and it means no. There's different things that I think too often get missed, and that makes it difficult for a smooth, equal interaction. But that's so very much important if we're trying to understand what we're trying to understand. I don't know if I answered all of the question. But.
No, but that was really interesting, Michael. So from what you're saying, you are actually challenging this comment that we often hear from people in the conservation community, right? That either you are pro people or pro wildlife, and very often somehow this empathy and this interest in the social culture of a place is seen to dilute your scientific abilities. But in fact, you have given us a very detailed explanation of how it's not a dilution, but an enhancement of your own scientific work, right? So you, from what you're saying, this act of imagination and this openness to engaging with whatever species it is we are studying, it does and should in fact be translated into a similar openness to engage with the local communities that we are working with. And I think you made a very important point about not treating communities as objects, especially when they don't share the same priorities as a conservationist might in a particular landscape. Thank you very much for bringing out that really important point. Minkit, if I could ask for your views on this. One of the challenges that people face is sort of building a conversation with the younger generation in any community on the value of nature or on what conservation might mean for them. Because, as you described earlier as well, aspirations are in some sense global. Like we all tend to have rather similar ideas of what a good life might be. And very often it doesn't really factor in the natural world at all. So could you tell us a bit about what you think of that? What is it about conservation that can speak to young people in particular, that too when they're from indigenous communities? And what have been your own efforts in that direction?
I think it starts young. The whole idea of conservation starts young, and like I addressed in the beginning also, a lot of our education system has become very closed-roomed, phenomena where we are in the room and kind of trying to study about conservation, which totally negates the whole idea of conservation. Because as indigenous communities, I think we are very, very experiential learning. So through the experiences, we kind of understand and learn more about environment, and especially from our elders, the traditional knowledge that they have kept, and how through the oral stories, through the rituals, through the folk narrative and dances and food, this conservation, right from the clothes we wear, the song we sing, or the food that we eat, addresses a lot of ideas or the topics that we can't talk about, like the food security and the water security. All these are a part of our way of life. But I think one of the challenges that indigenous communities are also facing, a lot of migration from the rural to the urban, and thereby kind of increasing the urban poverty. Of course, there has been exponential growth in the whole the GDP, and of course we are also getting into new companies that's coming, and like globalization that's coming in. But I think we detach ourselves in the whole pursuit of trying to survive in a capitalist economy, and I think while we try to do that, we somehow land up just surviving. So as a youth, as a young child, when you're said, okay, you will become a doctor and you will get money and you will earn more, I think the whole aspirations are very capitalist, as a parent also, as a education institutions also, and of course the respect and all are part of it, but conservation never is a part of the topic. Like you have to take care of your surroundings are never a narrative that is taught in the school. And I think that is the beginning of even kind of associating ourselves with conservation. Right now we have a lot of these revolutionary plastic pollution that's going on. People are making eco brick and all, but that's a very solution led. But I think the whole idea of coming closer to the nature, experiential learning are a very important part of the curriculum. So I, as a storyteller, one of the reasons why I transitioned from a filmmaker to the storyteller is because right now the youth are open to, almost in a day we watch more than 10 videos. And how many of those videos are going to impact us is something to question, and that is one of the reasons why we need community engagement, a person-to-person engagement. Although we are doing at an online platform, but a community to the way our elders used to sit down under a tree and connect with one another is what we need right now, more than any probably any competitions or anything, but just sitting down and listening to one another. I think conservation is a very simple topic if you really make it out to be, but it has to start from you. And how it starts is, like, I saw some questions that was coming about how I transitioned from advertising to conservation, is also because for me, advertising was giving me good money, but it was not satisfying my soul. Because when I came to know about the activism that was going on, and they said, okay, Lepchas, the Holy Land, the Holy River is in danger, that really started asking, that made me think of who I am. I think so as a youth, we have to do a lot of self-reflection to really know what is it that you want. And I mean, that's because I really got disturbed with the whole idea of like, what am I doing here? So when you address those problems at a very young age and try to not resolve, but at least get into the journey of discovering, I think you will really get into this whole idea of transition, which would be very organic for you. And the second part of it is also storytelling is not like an entertainment for me. It's a very, very educational journey where through the conversation, through our oral stories, which our elders used to tell, those stories needs importance. And I think more young people should give importance to our folk narratives and find the science in it. It is not the other way around. It is to go back to our elder traditional knowledge and find the science that you got in your teaching or school, So I don't know if I've answered, but that's what I felt.
It's interesting. Thank you very much. So, okay. Let me see if I got that right. You are suggesting that folk stories and returning to certain traditional narratives itself has a lot of value, and it helps people grapple with this idea of what does it mean to be an indigenous young person in today's world. Is that right?
Yes,
right.
And also to find collaborations with other communities. I think a lot of indigenous community also has a lot of insecurity because they have gone through a lot of marginalization, not just from the development perspective, from the capitalist, and also from education, where we have always been said, oh, they are the ones who walk naked with bows and arrows. So I think these kind of narratives needs to change, and the young people also need to find ownership of their own communities to document and be given a platform at an educational level, not necessarily because we all are not researchers. We cannot write as well as probably the researchers. But I think we need to find a space and an ecosystem where these this knowledge are addressed. So that is what I feel. Okay.
Thanks, Minkit. Samira, what are your thoughts on this last comment that Minkit made, that researchers write well? Do you think the way we write does justice to the communities we write about and the communities we work with?
No, they can't read anything that we write. It's of no use to them. So,
okay.
We live in that bubble. So I don't think that even the popular articles that we write or the papers, definitely even other scientists don't read our papers. So forget indigenous communities. Even the popular articles, as long as they are in English, it's not going to be accessible to anybody who really works on the ground. But can I quickly add something to some of the questions that I'm seeing because of shortness of time and something that Minkit in the thread that was continuing about youth. I just want to say that it's very easy for us, anybody, scientists, to say we want to empower communities. It's very easy to say that, and perhaps it comes with good intentions. But what do we mean by that, right? Before we even get to thinking about empowerment, perhaps we should take a lot of time to, like Minkit said, take 5 steps back and understand the community's history that we want to empower, and try to place ourselves in their shoes. And only after we understand their socio-political, economic milieu, their worldviews, should we even try to, if we have a conservation goal, should we even try to perhaps fit that into their worldview. Going to a place, it's again, we are doing parachute science, as Asha had said, in our own country. I just wanted to add that. And youth, somebody said youth are not interested, elders are interested. That's because of the history. They don't know the value of their own knowledge. So people who want to empower those youth, 2 things. First, look at your own traditional knowledge. How much of the knowledge that your grandparents knew have you retained? Have we retained? We haven't, right? We are in the same place because we had these aspirations and we have come here where we are. So before we judge them, take 50 steps back and do this, and then think, try to understand why those youth are in the place that they are, and what can we do to shift those spaces, facilitate that shift, not put ourselves in that place and try to, do some seismic kind of thing. Sorry.
That's a really interesting point, that empowerment is not something you can do to other people, but that it's something that they have to articulate for themselves and make decisions for themselves, right? And that's a really important thing that you brought up, Samira, because we also see a lot of this word being used rather loosely in conservation literature, where you have predetermined projects, set timelines, ways of doing, and then it all ends with this. Oh, and we empowered the community to do conservation the way we wanted it. Michael, I can see you smiling. Would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. What I feel about when I think of empowerment, some of my colleagues go thinking that they're going to turn some of these young people into primatologists. That's not empowerment, because that takes them away. That puts them on your airplane and flies them out of their world. One of the things that I always try to do is, sometimes it was mentioned earlier that they don't recognize. I think it was Minket that said it herself. Sometimes they don't realize what they have, what the value is of the knowledge they have, and often the best thing you can do is in my case is not to hope that they'll become primatologists, because they'll be poor. They won't have a job in their own country, and they won't be doing anything to help their own people, which I think is very impressive. And it's always moved me that most of the people that I talk with, what do you want to do? And they're always saying that they want to improve the situation for their families, for their village, for their tribe. And it's sometimes difficult, but it's important. Part of making equal partners is to show them that you feel you understand, or you feel the value in what they're doing and what they know, and then how that's important to us, but how that can further their lives as well. Whether it's helping them to get an education to do what they want to do within their community, for them to empower others in their village. Someone has to make the first move to gain some kind of control within their world. And sometimes we can help by just expressing how we feel, what their value is, how what they know is so important, just for what it is, not for what it is for scientists or for other people, but just, again, looking at each individual as a person, just like all of us, and think of ways to try and suggest how they can reach their own goals, not have them mirror our goals and become successful scientists or become professors somewhere far away from where they actually feel that they belong. So for me, that's kind of part of what empowerment means. Thank
you, Michael. That's a very thoughtful elaboration of what empowerment could mean. We've had several questions here. So this question I would just like to ask any or all of the panelists. There's a question of caste as well, right? Much as we've talked about ethnicity today, at least in the Indian context, caste is a huge, social determinant, and it does play out in all kinds of ways in conservation as in other sectors. So, oh dear, I see Minket has dropped out. But Samira, would you like to share some thoughts on, how you feel even the influence of caste on environmental discourses, is there, and how it can be changed?
Yeah, I'll just very quickly. So yes, of course, the conservation community in India is dominated by upper castes. We all know that. Let me just say that. We all belong to that community. It has to change, but how do we bring about that change is, of course, by the first step is to be aware that this is the problem. And unfortunately, we don't have Gladson and John here with us, but they would have been really I'm not an expert on these issues. All I can say is that, we have to be aware of this intersectionality of caste, which is unique perhaps to our country. And I'll just end this thread by sharing a quick anecdote. So, this constellation Orion, it's called Mancha in Soliga, which means bed. To them, it looks like a bed, and the sword, those 4 corners are the bed's corners, and the three stars in the middle that are visible, I think the sword or the belt, whichever, of Orion, they are 3 castes. One is a Soliga, one is a Nayak, and one is a Lingayat. And those 3 are constantly trying to make space for each other in that one bed. And I think that's more appropriate for me to narrate that perspective than put in any of my own perspective.
That's a lovely, snippet to bring it. Thank you. So the caste question is a particularly fraught Indian one, and I don't think we have any answers yet, because actually this entire business of turning the lens on ourselves and learning to reflect on how we do conservation is itself, unfortunately, a relatively recent turn of events, because traditionally conservation has, sort of taken 2 camps, and neither camp likes to talk to each other. So it's very nice that now people are willing to examine their own practices, but it's still a very nascent field. So we definitely need much more thinking aloud and thinking together on things like caste and language and gender. All of these are lines along which Indian society is deeply fissured. So it's not very surprising that conservation should also be fissured along these lines.
Yeah.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left. Before we wind up the panel, I would quickly like to ask, perhaps starting with Minkit, what might be 1 or 2 useful pointers for all young conservationists to keep in mind if they're interested in decolonizing practices? What ideas could you offer them, Minkit? Okay, I'm not sure her network is holding up either. Perhaps, Michael, could you set the ball rolling?
It's not a very intellectual response, but I think we should, when we go into a place, we should be thinking about giving, not taking, because it's in the giving and the exchange that we begin to understand what's important to the people who have invited us, or the animals who have invited us into their world. The most meaningful studies that I think I've done, people can argue that, but are not the ones that I had in my head when I went there, but the insights that I gained from listening and watching the animals or the people that I was working with, when I realized that we had some kind of interest and knowledge about the same thing, but theirs was a much more location specific interest. And that knowledge, without that knowledge, nothing that I've spent the last 35 years studying would have the same depth, the same meaning, because I would only have come back with a little bit more than what I went in. But when you're giving and exchanging, then things flow much easier, and you get a much deeper understanding, I think, when you try and understand their questions, what's important to them, and then you can turn that into a very productive research question.
Thank you. So letting the community drive your research questions sometimes is a very good idea. Yes, thanks. Samira, how about you?
Thanks. I just want to point out, because our listeners might be interested, something about Michael that they may not know. And I wish we had more time and we could listen to Michael about his collaboration with his the local community members, especially the family of medicine men, the medicine people whom you collaborated with, Michael, and whom he has made co-author in many of his publications. And but that is perhaps if, since you said one or two things that you would like to share with the people, one of them is this. And just this morning, a friend shared a revised policy put out by PLOS, the group of journals, on how they want to revise their publication policy by making sure that parachute science doesn't happen, and by revising author contributions and making sure that people who have collaborated in meaningful ways are not just left in acknowledgements, but made co-authors. And perhaps that's one thing that I would like people who are listening in to think about. If you think that your research could not have been possible without the contribution of somebody on the ground, even if they belong to another community, and even if they're not scientists, perhaps do consider making them co-authors in your publication. Whether or not that helps them in any way, that is the secondary question, but it is ethically the right thing to do, to acknowledge their intellectual contribution to your work is as the first step. Thank you.
Thank you for those quick pointers. Yes, Michael.
Just to add on to that very nice comment, I've never put a name of a local counterpart in there because he's a local counterpart. I've always put that person's name in because of the contribution that they've had to my thoughts, to our thoughts, and how we write things together. And especially the group of traditional healers who Samira was talking about, they don't speak English. They can write just a little, maybe write their name. So what I write isn't important to them from that perspective, but to know, and for their community to know that they've contributed in this way is one of the biggest joys that I get, is to being able to empower them, their knowledge, to give it significance to the world, and they can have that whether they can read that or not. They know the stories. We've sat together and we've talked about what we found and the contributions. I'll talk to the sons and to the daughters of some of these people who have already passed away, and they're just beginning to enter into a different part of society in Tanzania, away from the village. So they speak English. They're having an interest in different things outside of the village, and it kind of helps to bring them back to their village, to bring that connection back to them, knowing that their father, their uncle, their elders did this contribution that is beyond their village, but it's because of their village that this information is now out there, that people see how animals use medicine to treat themselves differently, and that these are the people who for all of their generations have looked to animals for knowledge about medicine. And now the world is looking to them for their knowledge. And but I would never use that for monetary gain. And I've turned down drug companies who asked to use that information. I said, it's not mine, it's these people's information. So authorship shouldn't be mandatory, but it should always naturally be obvious, their contribution, and not be afraid to put their names in there.
Thanks, Michael. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And in fact, there's a last question on to what extent is decolonizing science about vacating the space? Very provocative and interesting question, but I'm going to end it by saying that we need to vacate this space. However, we'll all be available to engage on Slack. So please do feel free to stay in touch with the panelists over Slack, and they'll be able to answer more questions there. Thank you all very much for attending. And I'm really sorry that neither Gladson nor John Ivy could join us today. But thank you, Minky, Michael, and Samira. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you
Honor
very
to
much.
meet Michael and Samira.
Bye.
Likewise. Thank you. Bye-bye.